and welcome back to AustinPlus, where today we have got a little bit of a balance wave here. Don't even know if that makes sense. I've had a rough day. But today we are talking about Infinity War and Endgame, because Doomsday is around the corner. Let's go back to its predecessor. The MCU spent over a decade building towards these two films, Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, but together they become one of cinema's biggest events. But despite telling one continuous story across two films, fans remain divided over which movie is actually better. Is Infinity War the superior movie, or does Endgame deliver the more satisfying conclusion? Yes, so today we are answering the question, which is the better movie, Infinity War or Endgame? So without further ado, let's get into this wonderful debate. So to start off with, yes, these two films did have very different goals. One of them was to introduce one of the most compelling stories, but then the other one was supposed to conclude this compelling story. It was probably around 5, nearly 6 hours of pure content of a whole story. So before comparing them, to start with, it's important to recognize that both of these movies were trying to achieve two different things. Infinity War is a thriller about inevitable defeat, while Endgame is a story about recovery, sacrifice, and closure. But one builds tension and the other provides resolution, and understanding these two objectives is essential for when judging the two of them. Now, I have my opinions. I can also justify my opinion, but I can also justify it for the other side as well. So, let's get into it. So, storytelling and structure. Infinity War does maintain the more relentless momentum from beginning to end, as there is a common cause between every group that appears in this. Multiple storylines unfold simultaneously, yet remain surprisingly coherent with the overall story. But every scene pushes the narrative forward for Thanos' inevitable victory. But Endgame contrasts that, or flips it on its head, is something you could say, because it deliberately slows the pace for a 3-hour film. But its first act focuses on grief before shifting into a time travel adventure, and then ultimately an epic finale. But I'll say its structure isn't consistently paced as the other one. I would say Infinity War, in terms of storytelling and structure, takes that home. Storytelling, it does it so much betterly paced, and the structure is so coherent, even no matter how much is going on. And as much as it all comes together, Endgame is just a bit too slow. Now, the villain you need to know when he's at his best. Now, there's a bit of a problem with Endgame, because Endgame has got two types, one of which dies in 10 minutes, and then the other one is one from a different timeline that ends up having the same purpose. So that one doesn't make sense to me, so I'd rather go with the first one, Infinity War, than the second. Yes, don't get me wrong, the story is amazing. However, one of Infinity War's greatest strengths is that Thanos is effectively the main character. The audience follows his journey, understands his motivations, and watches him accomplish his goal. And in Endgame, Thanos becomes a more traditional antagonist compared to any other antagonist we've had in the MCU before. And after the original version is killed early in the second film, while he is still threatening, he loses much of his complexity that made him such a compelling villain in the Infinity War, because they brought in a variant. And that's the danger with the variant that you're going into it with Avengers Doomsday. However, I have to give a point to character development for Endgame. That's not how... I give a point to Endgame for character development. There we go, we mixed it about a bit. Endgame places such greater emphasis on individual character arcs. Tony Stark finally becomes the selfless hero he always struggled to be. Steve Rogers earns the peaceful life that he sacrificed decades later. Hang on, isn't he coming back in Doomsday? Yeah, it's the same one as well. You risk running. You run the risk of fucking up that whole ending. Thor does confront his failure and depression in a way rarely explored in superhero movies, which is then re-reflected in Thor: Love and Thunder, and then we can see that growth in this movie. And while Infinity War does develop many characters effectively, Endgame delivers the emotional conclusions audiences have been waiting to see for years now. Action and spectacle, I think, is probably the biggest debate you can have with both of these movies, because the action is the pinnacle in Endgame. But in Infinity War, it is mental. It is nuts. Infinity War definitely... Both films feature exceptional action, but they use it differently. Infinity War focuses on the inventive battles across multiple locations, constantly, like, introducing new combinations of heroes and powers. Endgame does build almost everything toward its final battle, creating, I think, one of the largest superhero action sequences ever filmed. While Endgame delivers the biggest spectacle, I would say Infinity War arguably provides the more consistently engaging action. But that half an hour sequence of them in battle in Endgame, I think, is probably undefeatable. But in terms of consistency, Infinity War takes that. Okay. Emotional impact. There's no denying Endgame takes that reign. I mean, you have... We'll get into it. I mean, yes, Infinity War did have that emotional impact at the very end, with Infinity War shocked audiences with its like devastating ending, proving that heroes could lose. But the snap become one of the MCU's more defining moments. But Endgame, however, provides, I think, a different kind of emotion that I think takes the reins here, with sacrifice, a reunion, and a farewell, all within the space of half an hour. Tony Stark's death, Steve Rogers' ending. Or should we just neglect that right now, mainly because that means fuck all, right? And then the final, obviously, Avengers Assemble moment represents the sum of the franchise's most memorable emotional scenes. Yes, that is a hard one to compare, but I would say Endgame takes it. If you're using, like, if you're thinking as an MCU fan, you think of that. Rewatchability is very important because some MCU films you want to like go and watch them again, and many fans argue that Infinity War is easier to revisit because of its fast-paced and tightly constructed narrative. Yes, but Endgame does rely heavily on emotional investment built across more than 20 previous films. But its slower opening and focus on resolution may not have the same replay value, but they do carry greater emotional significance for long-time viewers. Now, both of these films do hold a lot of cultural and legacy impact because both films reshape blockbuster cinema, with Infinity War demonstrating that a major franchise could end on a complete defeat, while Endgame becomes one of the highest-grossing films ever made and concluded the Infinity Saga in historical fashion. But together they represent the peak of the MCU's cultural influence, so deciding between the two for that is kind of counterproductive because they both have even amount of pros and cons, but separating their impact is difficult because each depends on the other to achieve its full effect. So, which movie is actually better? If judged purely as a standalone film, Infinity War, I think, offers, a stronger screenplay, tighter pacing, and obviously a more compelling villain. That's why, for me alone, I go with Infinity War. But I also know for a fact I'm not the only one that thinks that. I think Infinity War is better, but Endgame is more impactful in terms of, like, it's a conclusion. A conclusion's always going to be impactful. But if judges the conclusion over a decade of storytelling, may I add, Endgame delivers more emotional payoffs than few franchises that have ever been matched. But the better film ultimately depends on whether you value the storytelling precision or emotional resolution more highly. Infinity War may be the more tightly crafted film, with stronger pacing and higher tension, and one of Marvel's greatest villains, but Endgame accomplishes something arguably even harder. It provides a satisfying ending to an 11-year cinematic journey. One is the MCU's greatest tragedy, and the other is its greatest celebration. And together they just represent the franchise at its absolute peak. There you have it. That's my thoughts on what is the best, what is best, Infinity War or Endgame. But do let me know what you think in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and comment what you would like to see on this very channel. But I hope you have an amazing day as always, and I'll see you on the next one, folks. Bye. Yeah.